And when he gets there, it's Bethel, the area he's at, is actually about 11 miles north of Jerusalem. So you can kind of get a picture in your mind of the area if you're familiar with the map of Israel. But this is more southern Israel at this particular point. So as he begins his journey, he stops after a couple days, and he lays down and he has a dream. And what's he used for a pillow? He uses a stone or a rock. So I'm hoping maybe he had a blanket on top of that or something, because that'd be pretty hard to rest your head on something like that. And he has a dream at night. And this is kind of unusual to this point in the scriptures, in the Bible itself, that such a vision as this is actually seen. And what does he see in his dream? Rather significant when you really think about it. What does he observe in his dream?
Angels go up and down.
Yeah,
and then lords at the top.
Yeah. Now, is this symbolic or is this literal? Hey, Andre, would it be possible to get the USB plugged in?
Yes, of course.
I had a picture of it, if we can get it. So he has this vision of angels and descending on a ladder, which is probably somewhat symbolic. I mean, I doubt very much angels use ladders to come from heaven to earth. I don't probably think that's probably a usual method, but it's something that human beings and Jacob would see. This is really kind of the first glimpse of the spiritual realm, in a deeper sense. In the book of Job, you see that, but so far in the book of Genesis right now, there hasn't been a whole lot of this type of a vision where you're actually getting to get a peek into the spiritual realm. And this is further talked about in the New Testament. It says there's powers and authorities and different categories of angels and demons in the spiritual realm, which we can't see. There's descriptions of them from time to time in the scriptures, but God is making a point to give Jacob this vision. And why is God giving Jacob a vision where angels are ascending and descending on this ladder? And I don't think the vision is just for Jacob. I think this vision is for us too. Why would God want to give this type of vision to human beings? Why would he want to?
Build hope that there is a heaven.
Yeah.
And I also think it's a reminder to Abraham about the original, all the people on earth would be blessed through him.
Oh, good. I'm glad you caught that. I wasn't sure if everybody would catch that too, because he did say all people were going to be blessed, not just his family. He says he's going to bless his family, but he's also going to bless all the peoples of the earth. And that becomes a theme throughout the Bible, although not always seen by everyone, but it certainly was a thing. It clearly shows that God in the spiritual realm is having his angels do what for humans? Other scriptures talk about this too. What is one of the purposes of angels?
I think you see there's a passage in the Gospels, I think, where Jesus says that the angels protect the little ones.
Okay, I've heard that. That's where I think the guardian angel thing came up too. But angels are kind of servants of human beings in a certain way. God directs angels in many cases to perform tasks that are beneficial to us as humans. And it's very important that we see that God is still active in the affairs of mankind through all the ages. Some people say that God just created everything and then he took a vacation and left and let it run on its own. He is very much involved in the works and efforts of mankind. And he's trying to make that point here to Jacob here, and for all mankind to remember that God is with us, he's watching out over us, and he's making things happen for our benefit. So that's a very important message to be that God wants us to be reminded of, that he's very much involved with us. Does Jacob actually see God? Does he see God in the dream?
Yeah.
It does say that, but also there's a scripture in Timothy that mentions the fact that no one can see God because he lives in unapproachable light. Deb?
Well, yeah, and earlier when you were asking, is this real or is it spiritual or reality or whatever, we hear passages that say that, the angel of the Lord visited so-and-so, where the angel came and did this. This is a dream from the beginning, so it's still a vision and it's still from the Lord, but it's still in that dream-like reality, not like Moses, who stood right in front of him and was changed.
Yeah, so it is different. In most cases in the scriptures, you can see that there's instances where people come into the presence of God, but there's very few instances where it seems like they actually come into the actual presence of God in his heavenly form. When it's in a dream, it's not in reality. It's not like when he's physically present there with the Lord. So there's a lot of scriptures that talk about that, whether you can actually see God or not. Because that's in that term where he says he lives in unapproachable light is something to really wonder about, I think, in a certain sense too. Jacob has very few provisions. I mentioned that last week. He leaves rather quickly. All it seems he has is his staff and some food for the trip. It doesn't appear that Isaac blesses him with goods so that he has money to purchase or acquire a wife, because Isaac himself was given a rich dowry to present to the families in Hera to acquire his wife. He doesn't seem to do the same for his son. He just sends him off, and we mentioned last week, it may be because he still is not real happy with Jacob. And he didn't have a lot of fondness for him. His mother did, but it doesn't appear that he did even at this point. So to send him away empty-handed like that was kind of rough. He was on foot. It appears that maybe he was alone, and if he was with anybody, it wasn't very many people. Where he was, when he went to get a wife, he had an entourage with him. He had a lot of people with him. So it's kind of a sad situation the way it's working out. But maybe it's for the good in the long run too. So, all right, let's go on and read a little further down here, verse 16 now. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called that place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's house, that the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me, I will give a tenth. So as Jacob wakes up from his dream, he begins to think, and he's kind of awestruck at this point, and his emotion is what? First off, when he wakes up. his emotion when he wakes up from the dream?
He's afraid.
Hey, he's afraid. He's scared. And it tells you about how vivid this dream must have been. The fact that it scared him like that. It's not often any of us have dreams that scare us like that, although once in a while I suppose we all do, but it was a very powerful dream. And he certainly gets the message that God is portraying to him. And his first reaction towards this vision is he draws a conclusion. What's his conclusion, his first conclusion about the dream itself?
That the Lord was there.
That the Lord was what?
Was there in that place.
Yeah, the Lord was in that place, and what else? That's part of it.
This was the house of God and a gateway to heaven.
Yeah. Now, if somebody were just saying that to you today, what would you say in response to that conclusion? I hear some smirks. Would you believe it? Is it?
That is the gateway to heaven?
Yeah. Is Bethel the gateway to heaven?
Well, the promise that God was making to Jacob about blessing all of the peoples of the earth, in some ways, could make it a gateway to heaven, right? We find we will have a home in heaven because of the sacrifice of Jesus that was really the promise through Abraham.
Okay, and we're going to go to that in a minute because I think that's part of the spiritual symbolism of this whole thing that he's having here. This particular statement that this is the gate of heaven and that this is where God comes and goes is kind of a little bit short-sighted, because when you look at Psalm 139, King David himself says God is everywhere. You can't go anywhere and be separate or apart from God, and he knows God is omnipresent everywhere, and that's part of God's nature, to be omnipresent. He can be everywhere at one time. So I can see why Jacob would draw this conclusion, but it's God is much more than oh, you did get that up finally, is much more than he's envisioning here. God can have angels enter in many different areas. It's not necessarily the gateway is here, and we can see that through other scriptures elsewhere too. Even in the book of Daniel, we can see that there's angels and demons fighting over different kingdoms, over the kingdom of Greece and Macedonia and some of these other areas. So these angels do get around quite a bit. And then he says, early the next morning, Jacob took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar. And what's interesting, there's actually a backstory to this, because there's a lot of people that in the past that used to get into artifacts from the Holy Land. And supposedly, somebody supposedly took this actual stone and took it to Scotland, and the kings of Scotland were anointed on that particular throne, or that stone, to become kings, which is probably completely ridiculous. A lot of the artifact stories usually are frauds and made up stuff. So just wanted to throw that out there, that here's an example where people have come up with stuff that probably wasn't true. What's interesting though also too about this place called Bethel, Bethel is a very prominent location in the scriptures. It had more, when I was kind of surprised when I looked at this article on Bethel, which means, the word Bethel actually means the house of God, but it refers to the whole area in which they were at. So Bethel is first mentioned in the Bible in connection with Abraham, who built an altar to God there, who went towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So Abraham was here too, in this particular spot. Many years later, Jacob returns to Bethel and builds an altar to God there. They called the place El Bethel, which means God of Bethel. Bethel remained one of the main worship centers of Israel throughout its history. The Ark of the Covenant was actually, for a time, kept at Bethel. There was many famous people that were associated with Bethel throughout the scriptures. I'm not going to read all the names, but only Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, is mentioned more frequently than Bethel in the Old Testament. So it's the second most mentioned place in the city in the Old Testament. It was also a place where a lot of idolatry happened too later on when the northern kingdom split from the southern kingdom. King Jeroboam set up golden calves at Bethel, and the prophets condemned him for doing that. It's also the location where Elijah and Elisha met together with the company of the prophets, and Elijah ascended to heaven in this particular area too. So we can see that that's another important event that happened at Bethel. And later on, I think it was in the 7th century BC, the high places of Bethel were destroyed by King Josiah as part of his religious reforms. And by the time of Ezra, which are getting pretty late in the Old Testament, the city of Bethel had been burned down and reduced to a small village. Bethel is not even mentioned in the New Testament. So in the Old Testament, it was a very, very prominent place among the Jews at that time. Verse 20. Jacob makes a vow, saying, if God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, and give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I will return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God. In this particular instance, does Jacob seek out God, or does God seek Jacob? Who seeks out who?
God seeks Jacob.
Yeah.
And we've seen that God pursues his people, right? We see him appearing to Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't Abraham searching for God, but God sought him out, and the same thing even with Isaac when God appeared to Isaac. So God is a pursuer of a relationship with mankind.
Yeah, turn over to John chapter 6, verse 44. This is a rather significant point. John 6, verse 44. This is Jesus speaking. Verse 43 in John chapter 6 reads, stop grumbling among yourselves. Jesus answered, no one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up on the last day. Skip over in the same chapter to verse 65. He went on to say, this is why I told you that no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. No one can come to the Father unless the Father has enabled him. What does that mean? Focus on that word a little bit, enabled, too. Does anybody else have any different word in their version?
Granted.
Huh?
Granted.
Granted, okay. What does that tell us about us as human beings and our relationship with God? Teresa hinted at it quite a bit there.
He seeks us.
What's that?
He seeks us.
He seeks us.
Then verse 66. Many of the disciples turned back and no longer followed him. So I think in their heart, they were there for other reasons. And they were like, whoa. They didn't feel like they were, they didn't have a relationship with God. I mean, they gave up right then.
Yeah. And I think sometimes when we think back on our own relationship with the Lord, when we think back to when we first turned to the Lord, I think there's more to it that goes on God's part than perhaps we would perceive. I think He has ways of getting us to, first of all, think about him in a more serious sense, that we need to pursue him a little bit more. And I think that desire partly comes from the Lord. He doesn't force it on us, but I think he does do that. And also, too, when I think of the word enables, the New Testament makes it pretty clear that there are two kingdoms in this world. The kingdom of Satan and the kingdom of God. How do we break away from the kingdom of Satan? Do we do that with our own power? That's something to think about. Does God have to perform an action to make it possible for us to get away from Satan himself? Because if Satan left to himself, and if God wasn't there to protect us, I think Satan would run roughshod over all of us. I don't think anybody could resist us in any way. So, as all human beings, it seems like the Lord will certainly has a hand in us coming to him and being able to break away from sin and evil in our lives. And thank goodness he does get involved and helps us in that way. And we shouldn't be arrogant thinking, you know, I've done this, I've done that, when it's probably God that did most of what it was to bring us to him in the first place. So God most certainly does reach out to Jacob here. Why does not God reach out to Esau in the same way? He reaches out to Jacob, but Esau, he condemns Esau. Why doesn't he do that for Esau? Or did he? Anybody remember what some of the last verses in Ezekiel 33, the last paragraph says about God's attitude towards human beings and sin? Does God take pleasure in the death of anyone? That's what that verse in Ezekiel chapter 33 says, the very last verse. God has no pleasure in the death of anyone. He tells us to repent. New Testament makes very clear, God reaches out to all mankind. He did at points reach out to Esau, but Esau rejected God on many occasions throughout his life. So fortunately, Jacob did not do that, and everybody gets a chance to come to the Lord as a result of that. Also, too, when you look at this particular verse here, can you discern Jacob's level of faith in God in verses 20 through 22? What's his level of faith? Why not, Rick? You're right, I agree.
The first one is if. You don't have total trust. He's making a deal. If you do this, this, and this, then I'm going to declare you my Lord. And God's already promised it.
Yeah. It's a very provisional faith, isn't it?
But that I can relate to that.
I think we all can. We all want God to do stuff for us too. And sometimes when we get really mad at God when things don't go our way, that's a sign that some of that is still in us, a provisional aspect of our own faith. You know, you promised to take care of me. Why is this all happening to me? So it's normal for human beings to feel this way. Very often our faith is provisional. We're hoping that God will take care of us. And when adversity hits us, sometimes it's confusing. We don't always know what God's up to and why he's allowing things to happen to us in the way it is. Also, too, he makes a promise in verse 22 that that on the stone was going to be a pillar, and it will be God's house. And he said he was going to give God a tenth of everything he has, which is the second time tithing is mentioned in the Old Testament. The first time was with Melchizedek, that story there with Abraham and Melchizedek. So this is the second time that is mentioned. All right, any questions on chapter 28 before we move to chapter 29? All right, let's move on. Chapter 29, verse 1. Then Jacob continued on his journey and came to the land of the eastern peoples. There he saw a well in the field with 3 flocks of sheep. lying near it because the flocks were watered from that well. The stone over the mouth of the well was large. When all the flocks were gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone away from the well's mouth and water the sheep. And then they would return the stone to its place over the mouth of the well. Anybody know why they put large stones over wells back in those days? As right here it says that the stone was large, and it says the shepherds were needed to roll it away. First off, most of the shepherds probably at this day and time were probably young boys. How old exactly, I don't know. King David was one of those type boys too. He's a shepherd boy in his early life, and very often shepherds were sometimes young boys, not always, but certainly there were probably young boys in most cases, and it would take more than one shepherd boy to move a stone away from a well. And why do they put a stone over the well? Why don't they just leave it open?
Was it so an animal didn't fall down there and contaminate the well?
Yeah. Have you ever read stories about in Africa, one of their biggest problems in Africa is dirty water. And that's why they gotta dig wells a lot of times in Africa, because they have to go down to get away from contamination. Because if you drink water from the lakes and streams in that area, there's a lot of animals there that do stuff in the water. And if you drink that water, you pick up all kinds of diseases. And especially if an animal dies in the water, who's gonna want to drink that water? I mean, even a bird could fall into the thing, or any animal whatsoever. They're trying to keep all animals out of there, and not to mention insects and stuff coming down and getting into the well and contaminating it. Dust and dirt, I mean, so they have a habit of, in ancient times, to keep rocks or stones over wells to protect them. And that way it made it harder for other people to get in and take the water if it wasn't their well in particular. So these shepherds were waiting for a while, and they when Jacob arrives, and like I said, it's probably about a 30-day journey for him to actually get there. So let's go on and read a little further. Verse 4. Jacob asked the shepherds, "My brothers, where are you from?" "We're from Haran," they replied. He said to them, "Do you know Laban, Nahor's grandson?" "Yes, we know him," they answered. Then Jacob asked them, "Is he well?" "Yes, he is," they said, "and here comes his daughter Rachel with the sheep." "Look," he said, "the sun is still high, and it's not time for the flocks to be gathered. Water the sheep and take them back to pasture." "We can't," they replied, "until all the flocks are gathered and the stone has been rolled away from the mouth of the well. Then we will water the sheep." While he was still talking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Then Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and Laban's sheep. He went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and the son of Rebekah, so he ran and told her father. So when he arrives in Haran, the first thing he asks is, he's trying to make sure he finds who he's looking for. And who's he looking for? Well, eventually Rachel. But before he gets to Rachel, he's looking for, the uncle, Laban or Nahor's grandson. Those are all relatives of his and of his mother's. And it's verified that yes, indeed, he is at the right place. So he's probably overjoyed because he took this long trip and he's finally found his relatives, because he's never seen them before. So he couldn't recognize them from a physical viewpoint because he's never seen them before in his life. And as he's standing there talking to these young shepherd boys, Who else also arrives on the scene? Who arrives on the scene? Rachel. And Rachel has a job too. What's her job? Apparently she's a shepherdess too, which means she's probably quite young, probably a teenager. We don't know for sure because it doesn't give the ages. She's probably a teenager. How old is Jacob at this point? He's quite a bit older. Somewhere between 40 and 50 years old. So there's a huge age gap between the two by our reckoning in our day and age. I'm not so sure it was back then. But nonetheless, he sees Rachel and he greets her as soon as he finds out who she is. And he kisses Rachel and he begins to weep aloud. So you can see how happy he is to the point that he's actually weeping. And just so there's no misunderstanding, relatives at that time, it was very common to kiss one another, because you're going to see in the next paragraph here that Laban and Jacob actually kissed one another. So it was very common for even males to kiss each other on the cheek, and they still do it to this very day in those cultures, in those lands. So that is real common for them to greet relatives in that particular way. So, so he's overjoyed that he's finally arrived where he's been tempted, or been where he had been assigned to go by his mother and father. Verse 13 now, let's read on. As soon as Laban heard the news about Jacob, his sister's son, he hurried to meet him. He embraced him and kissed him and brought him into his home, where Jacob told him all these things. And Laban said to him, "You are my own flesh and blood." After Jacob had stayed with him for a whole month, Laban said to him, "Just because you are a relative of mine, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be." So apparently, what was he already doing with Laban? He's been there for a month. What's he doing?
Gave him a job to do.
Well, he does, but he's voluntarily pitching in and helping out, obviously. I don't know what he was doing, it doesn't say, but apparently he was pitching in and helping out, like most relatives do if you were staying somewhere for a long period of time. So Laban asked him a question: what should your wages be? I think he might already have something in mind. Let's read on. Verse 16. Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah had weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel." Laban said, "It is better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Some of your versions in verse 17 says Rachel or Leah had tender eyes. There's kind of a dispute among the scholars of what that word actually is, whether it's weak or tender. Nobody seems to know. But Laban has 2 daughters. The older was Leah, the younger was Rachel. There is a contrast drawn in the scriptures between the description of the 2 girls. What can we gather from the description here?
Leah was the oldest.
Leah was the older. What else?
The younger was better looking, more attractive, or he was
There it
attractive.
is. Wonder who was gonna say that. Ed wasn't brave enough.
The modern version was said she was hot.
The modern version said she was not. Okay. Apparently she was. Whether Leah was homely looking, if you look at, if the version, the word is weak, it makes it sound like she's maybe not very attractive. If it says she had tender eyes, that could mean all kinds of things. So they were sisters. So nonetheless, it does seem like, Jacob, well, certainly has a preference, for Rachel, the younger one. And it clearly says, it just seems like it didn't take very long, but he falls in love with her right away. And, since he does not have a bride price, if he had the bride price, if his father had given him money and goods to acquire a wife, he wouldn't have to do what he's gonna have to do here very shortly, because he could have purchased the right to marry her at this point, but he doesn't. So what deal do they work out? Verse 8.
7 years.
What's the deal?
That worked 7 years.
He's gonna work 7 years for her. Does Jacob complain about it? Not really. It says he loved her so much, it just seemed like a few days to him that, to work for 7 years. So, as we go on too, there's some very interesting family dynamics that come into play here. And we'll talk about that next week because we're out of time now. But this whole story is interesting because why is Jacob here in the first place? To get a wife. But what prompted the quick thinking that he had to get there now?
So he would stay alive.
Yeah, because he got into a mess with his father, and him and his mom lied about a situation. And now we're gonna find out the roles are gonna get reversed here. Jacob's the one who's gonna get lied to. So, kind of makes you wonder what God is doing here in this particular spot, you know? Maybe he's teaching him a lesson perhaps about deception and lying. And we're gonna find out that Laban, the father, is not a very straight up guy. I mean, he's a pretty crooked himself. But we'll read about that next week. Any thoughts or questions as we close?
No, just, nothing to do with class. I don't know what's gonna be in the announcement, but, we should pray for the Ashby family. I'm not sure how many people know, but from what I heard, Carnissa did not get to go.
Right, yeah.
So I know that's gotta be very hard on both sides, and
Yeah, I heard she got the flu,
yes, it could be more.
and she's with her relatives, I believe.
Yeah.
But I'm sure she's really sad about
Well,
that.
and the mother and father over there, and the grandma without her, yeah, it's
Yeah.
put a cloud over their vacation.
Yeah, I remember years ago, we were taking a big trip to Disney World, and my middle daughter got the measles. I can relate. It's like it's up and down. You want that?
And I have a little, I didn't know about that.
Hey, how are you?
Right.
How many fishes? How many?
I have 3 natural. Way in past. He said, by the time I see you come around this.
Anybody that says that.
When I read it, it was weird. And all of a sudden, all there was grass.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
And what I was thinking.